Dobro utro, good morning. I'm going to switch to English. This will be an English-only event because we have a number of participants online, Zoom, all from all around Europe, looking to see what Bulgaria has in stores for the offshore wind sector. I have the pleasure to have Ambassador Nielsen with us. The embassy of the Kingdom of Denmark was so nice to co-host this event with us. We're happy to have him give the opening remarks as well. Before that, I just want to give you kind of an introduction to what the Center for Study of Democracy and together with some key policymakers in the country have been doing to kickstart the development of the offshore wind energy sector over the last 2 years. And this is critical because the world has changed since February 24th this year. And the Russian invasion in Ukraine has shown very clearly that energy and climate security risks are going to be the main force for political change in Europe over the next decade and even more. Solving the energy and climate security nexus will be key to unleashing a new economic model for Europe, an economic model for the world. In that sense, offshore wind, paradoxically, plays a key role in bridging the gap between energy and climate security. Europe is basically giving green light to the industry as a key cornerstone for finding a way to reducing fossil fuels imports from authoritarian countries and to boost the most competitive energy industry that Europe has so far, the offshore wind industry. Europe is a leader all across the world. Recent tender competitions in the US showed how actually European companies are the most competitive ones and are ready to pick up the development and the unlocking of the offshore wind potential all across the world. Bulgaria is lagging on this front. Bulgaria is the only country with a coastal access in Europe that hasn't started working on developing the sector yet, but this may be changing. The reason is that new technology and new assessments have shown that the Black Sea possesses enormous technical economic potential for offshore wind energy. As an assessment done by CSD in September 2021 showed that the Bulgarian section of the Black Sea holds 116 gigawatts of technical potential for offshore wind, out of which 26 gigawatts can be potentially accomplished using mature bottom-fixed technologies. To do that, though, we need to create the right environment, regulatory and economic environment, to attract investment and to attract technology providers to an overly heated market in which all countries are vying, competing for access to the biggest developers and the biggest technology providers in the world. From that point of view, we are very optimistic that in the beginning of this year, in early March, we had a hearing at the Energy Commission in the Bulgarian Parliament where all energy MPs from different political parties confirmed their support for the development of a new offshore wind energy regulatory framework for Bulgaria. And since then, CSD has partnered with some of the ruling coalition MPs at that time to develop the first draft of such a legislative concept. Today, we're happy to present the contours of this regulatory framework without going into too many details, and would like to hear the feedback coming from the business community and from regional experts from Southeast Europe who have worked on similar legislative frameworks in Romania and Greece. We also hope to have we already have some representatives of the biggest political parties in the country. I hope by the end of the discussion we'll have some other members of the biggest parties in the country. At 11:20, I think the Deputy Prime Minister for EU funds and climate policy, Mr. Pekanov, is going to join the discussion as well. And we want this to be a dialogue on how to continue the process of developing this regulatory framework. What are the next steps? And we'll provide some initial guidelines, and we'll love to hear your feedback on what can be done and how quickly we can do it. Now, with no further ado, I'll give the floor to Ambassador Nielsen for his opening remarks and for sharing the experience that Denmark has had in leading the way of developing the offshore wind industry in Europe, and how does this help solve the energy and climate security conundrum. Ambassador Nielsen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Excellency, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Vladimirov, and thank you to the CSD for arranging this conference. I'm honored and pleased to be here today. In the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Putin has pushed Europe to the brink of an energy crisis. However, Russia's use of energy as a political weapon and threats to cut off gas also presents an opportunity for Europe to accelerate its renewable energy production. While we are meeting here today, Denmark's Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, and the Minister for Climate, Energy and Utilities, Dan Jørgensen, are the official host of the Baltic Sea Energy Security Summit. The Baltic Sea has a substantial, but largely untapped, potential for offshore wind energy. Germany, Poland, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Denmark will meet with the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and Energy Commissioner Kadri Simpson. But even before the summit, Denmark and Germany have agreed to complete the planned Bornholm Energy Island. When established in 2030, the Energy Island will be the first of its kind and can supply between 3.3 and 4.5 million Danish-German households with green electricity. In May earlier this year, a North Sea summit was held in Esbjerg. Heads of governments from Denmark, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands took an enormous step toward reaching the EU's climate neutrality goal by co-signing a joint declaration that will make the North Sea a green powerhouse for Europe. Together, the four countries want to harvest at least 150 gigawatt of offshore wind in 2050. So turning from the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, I think it's only natural that we also look for the potential for offshore wind energy in the Black Sea. How does Bulgaria benefit from wind in the Black Sea, and what's important to keep in mind? Denmark has had a long history with wind energy, onshore as well as offshore. In the beginning, it was necessary to give subsidies to the industry. However, we are now beginning to make money on wind energy. When Danish and foreign energy companies contested for the contract to build the Thor offshore wind farm in the Danish North Sea, the bid from the German company RWE won the tender. RWE now holds the right to construct and operate the offshore wind farm. The agreement not only adds a further 1 gigawatt of green electricity to the Danish grid, it also marks the beginning of a new chapter in the deployment of Danish wind power. This is the first time that a Danish offshore wind farm and connection onshore has been built without state aid. Instead, the Thor project is expected to generate 375 million euro for the Danish government when the first turbines start turning and producing power for the electricity market. However, I think it's important to stress that it will be a long journey for Bulgaria before the money starts coming in. Many things have to fall into place, and one thing in particular is very important: a clear legislative framework. I'm therefore very glad to be here today, where we will discuss exactly this issue. I have to admit I'm not an expert on this issue, but I'm pleased to see among the many distinguished participants today, Mr. Benoit Bisset, Climate and Energy Attaché at the Danish Embassy in France. He will be able to provide further information on the Danish experience and highlight any relevant lessons for Bulgaria. So in conclusion, the present energy crisis, however tragic, is also an opportunity for Bulgaria. Offshore wind in the Black Sea will further diversify Bulgaria's energy mix and both reduce the carbon footprint and reduce the dependency on Russia. And if done right, it can be profitable for the Bulgarian state. I very much look forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Nielsen, and thank you for supporting the process in Bulgaria. Now I'll give the floor to my colleague Constanța Rangiova, who is a senior analyst at the Energy and Climate Forum. Dr. Ivanov, who had to deliver the keynote as the chairman of the Energy and Water Regulatory Commission, excused himself because they have an emergency meeting on gas security today at 10:30. Unfortunately, he is not going to be able to come. Maybe he can join the discussion at the last moment and provide the closing remarks, but he's very sorry not to be here. He, though, reconfirms his support for the development of a new regulatory framework, as the energy regulator will play a key role in managing the future tenders for auctioning offshore capacity in the Bulgarian section of the Black Sea. But we can discuss the details in the next hour or so. Now I'll be happy to open the discussion, the panel discussion, I mean, and give the floor to Constanța Rangiova to present the speakers of the panel and the rest of the expert discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Distinguished guests, it is my real pleasure to see you everyone today at this discussion, and I really very much look forward to hearing what all of the speakers have to say today. Just one organizational point, we have only about 50 minutes, so to be efficient, I will open the floor for questions and comments from the audience only at the end of the official panel discussion. And now let's move to the interesting part. First, I would like to give the word to Maria Trifonova, who is a research fellow at the Center of the Study of Democracy, and she will tell us how and why Bulgaria can unlock its offshore wind energy potential and what needs to be done, what are the next steps we need to do. Thank you, Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Constanța. Hello, everyone. I'm very glad to be here today with all of you and to share with you the results of our exciting work from the recent months or even years. I need my presentation. I have prepared some slides for you. Okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to note that the potential for offshore wind energy deployment in the Bulgarian section of the Black Sea has begun to trigger interest for the last couple of years. As you can see from this comparative table, each subsequent study estimates higher numbers, and this is due to first technological advancement. So the most powerful wind turbine with 15 megawatt capacity will be installed later this year, as announced just a few weeks ago. In combination with another reason, and these are newly discovered approaches for multi-use of maritime spaces and coexistence of various economic activities. So in our techno-economic assessments from 2021, the yellowish area here on the slide, we estimated the technical potential for offshore wind projects which could be developed with mature bottom fixed technologies at 26 gigawatt, and then modeled promising areas in the Bulgarian waters. Our analysis concluded, as already said, that the lack of legislation, the lack of sound regulatory framework, and the lack of strategic signals to the investors are one of the major bottlenecks. The report that we are launching today is intended to equip the Bulgarian policymakers with knowledge about various international experiences implementing wind projects at sea, and to provide recommendations for regulatory framework that would ensure the best takeoff for offshore wind power in Bulgaria. It covers 4 advanced countries, 4 countries with mature markets, and 3 emerging markets, and these are Greece, Poland, and Romania. We identified as most important aspects that needs a special regulation in this process. First, the regulatory competence, who is actually responsible for what kind of what part of the processes, which are the leading parties in the planning, site identification and development, how the permitting process could be designed to actually save time and risk investment, what are the different approaches in terms of grid connection, environmental contesting, and different approaches in terms of investment incentives and cost allocation. Here you can see some results in this comparative table. I'm not going into details. I just would like to share some observations that we've made when developing this analysis. So, first of all, we saw that state authorities in the countries under review have improved their administrative capacity in the recent past decade, and then they have taken a proactive role in spatial planning, in infrastructure development, and in the resolution of possible conflicts between different offshore economic activities. So centralized development models are becoming mainstream, so to say, in combination with competitive auctions. Both intervention require greater governmental intervention, and then they have proved to be a critical driver for tapping national offshore renewable energy potential. But spending public money in the industry's formative years to de-risk the private sector investments brings also higher financial returns at the market when the market matures. And for instance, we can observe that with negative subsidies or payback amounts pursuant to the contract for differences, the offshore wind industries in the Netherlands, Germany, and United Kingdom have supported citizens in times of skyrocketing power prices amid the transformation of the energy sector. Then another tendency is that not only price criteria are considered in recent auctions, but also sustainability criteria become even more important. Such sustainability criteria include the use of locally produced equipment, investment in coastal communities, environmental protection, as well as a different proposition made by developers in terms of innovation. Built on the best practices that we have identified in our reference countries, in these 4 reference countries, we propose a concept for the Bulgarian offshore wind legislation that integrates 2 separate site development models in order to first ensure flexibility and smooth progress of the industry, and second, to maximize social and economic benefits. We believe that since the areas in the Bulgarian section of the Black Sea, which can be easily exploited by offshore wind energy developers, are limited in size, the most promising zones should be identified at a very early stage, and they should be auctioned off. The Bulgarian government should allow prospective investors to propose developing the areas at the lowest possible cost for electricity generation. And based on the techno-economic assessment of the offshore wind potential, we suggest the way to plan auctions initially for areas with a minimum of 1 gigawatt capacity until 2027, and another 2 gigawatts by 2030. Since these numbers are not included in the strategic framework right now, we propose that the law prescribes their inclusion in the planning documents. The so-called centralized model that I just mentioned envisions that the Bulgarian authorities are having a leading role carrying out the identification of priority areas, and also ensuring grid access prior to the auctioning of the site. Then the developers enter the process at the pre-construction phase only if they submit a bid with the lowest strike price in contract for difference for specific areas. Then in parallel to the centralized model, the proposed legal concept foresees also an open door procedure, or the so-called investor-led model, in which offshore wind developers conduct all the preliminary studies for areas without priority status. They would then receive exclusive rights for offshore wind power plant development and operation if the studies prove also the feasibility of the sites. The exclusive rights are guaranteed by a concession regime, granted by right of the holder of a site investigation permit. To guarantee the competitive open door procedure, Bulgarian authorities should also publish a notice of expressed interest for non-priority areas and invite other interested developers to submit competitive application for site investigation. And this is the way to include also a competitive procedure in this second developer offshore wind developing model. We've included in our study also something which we call a checklist, or a catalog of 20 policy recommendations, which we believe could guide policymakers, not only in terms of the most important aspect that should be included in the legislative framework, but also in terms of sequence of all these steps. We believe that the first step is to give a clear signal to industry players, and the Bulgarian government could do that by integrating offshore wind energy deployment targets into existing strategic document, and through the designing a special wall. Currently, the current legislation do not forbid site developing and permitting, but we believe that a special wall could give a clear signal to investors and could also help avoiding conflicts with other legislative regimes. Then we believe that the next very important step is to actually appoint a one-stop shop for project developers. And we actually also elaborate how this could be done in the report. Then in terms of the planning and site identification, I think the most important thing is that we need a separate plan, the so-called offshore energy site development plan, to also avoid collisions with the maritime spatial plan and to allow these both documents to step on each other. Then in terms of site development strategy, as I said, we propose the two site development models to be integrated in the offshore legislation. As I said, to enable competition between industry players in both site development models. It is also very important to explore opportunities for regional cooperation, because the markets in countries like Romania and Bulgaria are limited, and the market is heated, as Martin said earlier, and to ensure supply chains, it's very important to develop both markets in coordinated manner. In terms of permitting, I think the most important thing is to have clear deadlines and transparent trrough. In terms of administration and competence, it's important to integrate the EU plans for developing offshore grid corridors into the current grid development planning, to avoid competition among different types of renewable energy developers, and to ensure binding grid connection deadlines. Then we also need clear rules for cost compensation to investors that have developed grid infrastructure as well. And as a most powerful instrument for investment in incentivizing, we propose the application of contracts for difference because this is first a scheme that stabilizes offshore wind farm income per unit of generated electricity, and as I pointed out earlier, it avoids over-subsidizing in periods with high wholesale power prices and even allows paybacks to the citizens in times of skyrocketing prices. There are many details which we touch upon in the report in our study. So I really recommend reading this piece of paper. Thank you I would like to express my gratitude to all our colleagues that are today here with us, which participated in consultation, to the legal advisors, because this report needed really interdisciplinary expertise. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria, for this very interesting presentation. Indeed, Bulgaria has a very long way ahead of it, a lot of catching up to do. But with this report, certainly the road is much, much easier to take than before. And we have also a lot of opportunities ahead of us, especially for new business, for coastal communities. And to tell us about what lies ahead and bring a broader European perspective, I would like to invite Victoria Kierowska to take the floor. She is Head of Advocacy and Messaging at Wind Europe, and she has extensive knowledge about Europe's efforts to promote offshore wind energy, and she can tell us also about what the plans for the Black Sea region are. Victoria, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Constanza. Good morning to everyone, and also thank you very much for the invitation and the report that you have just presented, Maria. I think it's very nice that we are discussing offshore wind in the Black Sea, because as it has been said at the beginning already by the previous speakers, unfortunately, Bulgaria is a little bit lagging behind developments happening across Europe in this field. And so it would be also nice if we take a couple of steps forward, especially now at this time. Allow me maybe here to tell you briefly what I'm planning to touch upon in my remarks. I would like, first of all, to talk a little bit about the long-term perspective of things, because, of course, right now we are in an energy crisis in the middle of it, so sometimes it's also very easy to fall for the short-sighted point of view, but we need to bear in mind the long-term road that Europe will be taking and where also I believe Bulgaria needs to go. Secondly, I'm going to also touch upon some of the elements that Maria presented in the key recommendations, and also to tell you the view of the European wind industry. What do we believe would be the necessary ones for a starting point in offshore wind in Bulgaria? So with regards to the first point on the long-term decarbonization scenarios, you know that at least from a European Union point of view, the path is very clear. It will be towards renewables. Why am I saying that? Because right now in the EU, 15% of our electricity is already delivered by wind energy. Solar is another 6%. So variable renewables, broadly speaking, are already providing 20% of our power in Europe. To reach our decarbonization goals in just 20 years' time, by 2050 now, it would mean that we would need to increase wind energy to 50%. So 50% of Europe's electricity would be wind in 20 years' time. Solar will be another 30%, bringing variable renewables to 80% in the power mix. And this is huge. And it means that this direction is not going to change. Because when you read the new European Energy Security Strategy, Repower EU, which was published in May this year, it says very clearly that renewables will be the key for us to be a little bit more independent in the current crisis, for us to regain the control over our prices. And they also say that renewables would be of overriding public interest. And I really want to stress on that, because it essentially means that when we're looking for different solutions, when we're looking for different scenarios, and when we make a choice about our long-term investment objectives, this is something that all European countries will need to take into consideration. And I also want to underline that Bulgaria is also sitting in these discussions in the Council of Ministers in Brussels, and certainly is something that will need to be taken into account as and when we have a new government, as and when we start discussing energy strategy going forward. So with these initial remarks, going forward to offshore wind, I also think it's important for us to contrast where do we sit with the Black Sea compared to other sea basins in Europe. Martin said it at the beginning, Europe at the moment has given a green light to offshore wind. This is very true. We have a European offshore strategy, which says by 2030 we need to have 300 gigawatts of offshore wind in Europe. We are now at 15, we were at 15 at the end of 2021. So this is a huge increase. And in this regard, we see that other sea basins are already working together in a regional context to bring this forward for many different reasons. First of all, it makes economic sense right now at the moment because the industry has been through a very significant cost reduction curve in the past years. And here, if we are to point out to very recent results from auctions, coming back again to what Martin said at the beginning about the UK, over the summer, we had the biggest renewable energy auction in the UK, where the strike price for offshore wind was at 43.8 euros per megawatt hour. So this is quite low. It was a record low breaking price. And I think it's important for us to bear in mind that renewables, wind energy, both onshore and offshore wind, today are the most cost competitive sources of new power generation. That's important. Secondly, as I said again, all of us, we want to touch base also on the fact that there would be a possibility for us to steer economic activity going forward. And here also every new wind turbine that we install brings approximately 10 million euros of economic activities to the regions where it is installed. And this is important because when we talk about offshore wind, it's also about bringing jobs, bringing growth to regions and coastal areas that normally probably would not have had such type of an opportunity otherwise. And this is something that countries are getting along with. And as I said, regionally, things are moving forward on creating the visibility for investors, on creating the regulatory schemes for investors. So Mr. Ambassador here from Denmark said it at the beginning, we have already seen this movement in the North Seas, where the 4 countries, so Denmark, Germany, Belgium, and also the Netherlands, they agreed a couple of months ago that they want 65 gigawatts of offshore wind for 2030. As he also said, today we're seeing another 8 countries from the Baltic meeting in Bornholm to also make offshore wind one of the key strategic pillars of their energy security in this region. Vasilis here is going to talk about what's happening in neighboring Greece, where concrete steps are taken for an offshore law. We know that in Romania, our colleagues have also been working on a regulatory framework. Turkey is also taking steps. So where are we in Bulgaria? And here I really want to underline, as I said before, now is the moment, and we need to take the next step forward. With regards to the key policy recommendations from the report that Maria presented and what we think is extremely important, I will speak about 3 key things. The first one is about the visibility. So the targets, what do you want to achieve and how do you want to achieve it? I think it's extremely important for the Bulgarian government, as and when it's formed, to indeed write down very clearly in strategic documents concrete targets for offshore wind development, because at the moment this is not the case. And when you have an industry that is ready to go into the sector, this is one of the first things that people are looking at and investors are looking at. This needs to be written down, and I think also the fact that we now need to also update our 2030 National Energy and Climate Plan, and we need to submit it, by the way, to Brussels in 2023, offers a very good opportunity and hook for us to take the step forward. So that's my first point. Second point, when we're talking about also the possibility of doing auctions, I also want to underline, we need to have auction schedules. And this again, in the European regulatory framework, whenever governments are designing such auctions, they need to provide at least a 3-year visibility on the auction rounds, which means the volumes that they plan to put forward, the budget that they're planning to invest. So this also needs to be written down very clearly. And this helps the investors to know how to plan, where to put their manufacturing sites, how and when to do the necessary investments in the supply chain. So critically, this is also a first step that we need to be taking forward. And the third thing I would like to underline would be in particular with regards to the support mechanisms. And I think in Bulgarian context, it's important also to say that we're now talking about revenue stabilization mechanisms. As I said earlier, when we discuss renewables in a broader context, We're no longer talking about subsidies, but revenue stabilization. And in this regard, we as an industry very much also agree that we need to have market-based premiums, ideally in the form of a contract for difference, because it really is about the link between investors and also the policymakers. With the CFD, the good side of it is that, of course, you win an auction with the strike price. If the electricity price on the market is below the strike price, the government pays you back. But if the electricity price is above your strike price, it's the investors that pay back the government. So this is an optimal scheme in which you can balance out the economic contribution of the sector together with the societal interests. And so therefore, contracts for difference from our perspective seem like a very good way forward. And just to give you an illustrative example why this is a very good solution from a price perspective, imagine, just for the example, that you win an auction with a price of 50 euros per megawatt hour. If you're under a CFD and you go to a bank would normally be very happy to see that you have secured the contract over a 15-year period because you have the visibility of the revenues. And so therefore, they will give you a loan with a lower interest rate, so it makes your project cheaper for the investor, but also for the society. If you do that without the CFD and you have a different contract, the price that you would end up with would be around 92 euros per megawatt hour. So you see the difference between being on something which has the security and being on a contract premium with a higher risk from a governmental and also societal perspective. So these three things, I think it's very important that as and when Bulgaria decides to go into offshore wind, are taken into consideration in the first regulatory framework. The last thing that I want to underline is with regards to regional cooperation and also funding, because Maria also said it's important that we look at this also with our neighbors, so notably here Romania, in particular for the Black Sea region. And I think in the European Union at the moment, we have many opportunities to make the most out of offshore wind and also to benefit from different financial instruments in there. One thing which easily comes to mind is about how do you also get along offshore development with the necessary infrastructure, which for me is first and most grids and also the ports, right? So on grids, we normally know that the European Union needs to be doubling investments already by 2030. And this is something that we need to discuss also with our neighbors on how do you start building the on and offshore connections, also the different infrastructure that would be needed at sea. So this is something that we need to be looking at with them also together. But on the side of the ports, we have in Bulgaria 2 big ports that potentially could also benefit for the creation of such an offshore wind development with the necessary supply chain. And this is also a movement that we're seeing in many different countries in Europe happening already. Under the National Recovery and Resilience Plans, different countries from other sea basins are requesting quite a lot of financing to go into these priorities. Just to give you one example, the Polish government is now going to have 400 million euros for offshore wind and ports, and they're going to have an additional 300 million euros for the grids. So you see, there are ways in which we can make this work together, and I think we need to also seize the opportunity right now in the current context to make the most out of what is at our availability. So I will leave it with these remarks there, but of course happy to touch base on other points, and many thanks again to the team of CSD for this conference and the report that you're presenting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for these insights. Indeed, the offshore wind energy industry of Europe has made a huge progress over the last several years, and Bulgaria now has the perfect opportunity to become part of this success story. And to zoom in on one particular very bright example of how to develop an offshore wind industry, I would like to invite our guest, Benoit Bizet, to take the floor. He will share, he is a climate and energy attaché at the Royal Dutch Embassy in France, but he will also bring his experience working at the Danish Energy Agency, and he will tell us about how Denmark has successfully developed its offshore wind energy industry. Benoit, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me here, and I'm very glad to be able to present you some of the following up from the introducing remarks from the ambassador, because I will try to give you a brief overview of the journey that Denmark has been through in order to reach the results that the ambassador was referring to. And one very important point is that it's been a long journey, though. But the thing is that Denmark started a long time ago, and the journey was long because it started small to get big. And I guess that in many countries in Europe where you don't start as small, and you may start bigger. So you may also develop faster, but you cannot jump all the steps anyway. So if you can give the next slide, please. Can you switch the next slide? Is it possible? Or maybe I can do it. I don't know. I don't think I can actually. Perfect. Thank you so much. Yes, this is just a brief overview of the journey that Denmark has been through. So as many of you may know, Denmark was developing what was called the first offshore wind farm back in 1991. It was a very small wind farm. It was only 5 megawatt, 11 turbine. So this is not even half the size of the turbine that is installed these days. So this was the beginning of the long journey. And just to see here the overview of how the installed capacity has been growing. It was a very slow start from the early 2000 with only 2 wind farms, which were at this time the 2 largest wind farm in Denmark, reaching a capacity of half gigawatt almost. And the first gigawatt of installed capacity was reached in the early 2010, where there were several different projects around the country. A major step was taken the past years with the newly operational Kriegers, and all these projects were reaching together 2.3 gigawatts. And now, as the ambassador was mentioning earlier this morning, the next project will have a different size. The first was just awarded was Thor of 1 gigawatt, and the next what will be awarded is also 1 gigawatt, but it will be also able to imply some P2X in order to start the new generation of how to use wind power. Besides that, Denmark will be the pioneer in building energy island. Again, here there are 2 types of island. One is a non-existing island that would be built in the North Sea, where there would be, to start with, 3 gigawatt of installed capacity, but with the potential of 10 gigawatt in this island. On the other hand, as it was just mentioned before, there is a conference going on in Bornholm in order to discuss how the Baltic will contribute to the energy supply. And this Baltic energy island for Denmark was going to be the island and was supposed to be 2 gigawatt, and it was actually just by today raised to at least 3 gigawatt. So this is the situation as it is now, and we expect to have an installed capacity of around 9 gigawatt in 2030 and probably around 25 gigawatt by 2050. So next slide, please. In order to get to these targets, you need to have some targets on the political side, but also some results that shows that you are actually getting to the targets. So first line is some of the results that Denmark has achieved during these past many years. So as we see now, we have around 47% of the power consumption that is covered by wind energy only. And this is actually 50%, but we have 3% of wind power curtailment that is due to some congestion in some of the neighboring countries that cannot always accept the power that we can send to them. And even though we have such a high share of renewable in the system, or at least in wind energy, we still have a security of supply of 99.996% of the time, which means that it's around 20 minutes of outage by average in that any Danes should expect to have without power. So this is also to highlight the targets that the Danish government has been taken from the last agreements in 2018. We want to reach 100% of the power consumption covered by wind power. And like many other countries in Europe, we will also get to climate neutrality in 2050. And we want to also reduce the greenhouse gas emission by 70% compared to the level of 1919 by 2030. So these are important to highlight because the wind power in Denmark is having a crucial role in these targets, and they will be provided mostly by electrification of the country. And next slide, please. This is just to show the journey that wind power has been taken from 2005. And as you see here, the first figure is the number of percent of energy consumption, of power consumption covered by wind. And then in brackets, you have, first of all, the onshore share and the offshore contribution. So as you see, it started around 18 with the 14% of onshore wind and 4% of offshore wind. And by 2030, we expect that we will actually get more than the 100% that we are targeting. But as you see here, the switch is very big, where onshore wind is going to be almost half the size of offshore wind for Denmark. Next slide, please. And I want to highlight the reason why it's good to go offshore, because offshore is bringing some very high capacity factors, and it actually creates a very stable supply. The graph here you can see is showing in red the solar capacity factor, and the turquoise blue is showing the onshore capacity factor, and the dark blue showing the offshore capacity factor. As you can see here, of course, you have a change in solar capacity factor due to the fact that you have night, and of course the sun is not really shining in night. Therefore, you have the highest capacity factor in the middle of the day. You see that the onshore capacity factors are relatively stable, but they are not as high as the offshore wind because of the wind power difference, and also the stability of the wind offshore. There is a large advantage.
Can you please, you have 2 minutes left, just so.
Yes, yes, I will take that. And the good thing is the low interference with the land use, because when you use offshore, you don't interfere so much with the land, and it makes you independent of fossil fuels, which is very much relevant these days, and it also creates a lot of job and growth on local. Next slide, please. It's been mentioning before the importance of having a centralized permit. In Denmark, we have this one-stop shop, and the one-stop shop brings some of these de-risking, and it means that the governments are supporting this by law, and also because of long and broad political agreements, we are ensuring stability on the long term. We ensure transparent and open processes. Next slide, please. This is the concept of one-stop shop. The idea is to centralize everything by DEA, and that the DEA will coordinate with all the relevant agencies that are involved in the permitting. And the idea is to ensure a smooth and very administratively lean process in order to develop the wind farm very fast. So DEA coordinates and prepare all the licenses and permits with all relevant authorities. Next slide, please. Very brief, maritime spatial planning, very important, as it was also mentioned. Site selection, then we do the preliminary studies in agreement with the industry. So we are ensuring that we are delivering what the industry is needing. We are having investor dialogue also to ensure that the terms and conditions of the tender material is in coincidence with what they are expecting, so they are flexible and attractive. We pre-qualify to have a group of several and competitive pre-qualified, and then we award a tender. So far, it was the lowest price. It might be changing in the next tenders. Next slide. That was the need to remember the connection that you will have to need with your neighbors. It's important that wind power is generating only for your country, but also for your neighbors, because they have to be shared, since that they will have some differences in net stability. So that was basically what I wanted to say here, and I'll be happy to deep dive in some of the topics with the Q&A session. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Benoit, for these excellent remarks. Indeed, Denmark has been very ambitious in its offshore wind energy development plans, and this has definitely paid off. And now let's switch the focus a little bit from the already well-developed offshore wind energy markets to those that are only now taking their first steps in that direction. And to help us make that switch, I would like to give the word to Mariano Gonzalez Serrano, who is Senior Energy Specialist at the World Bank. He has over 20 years of experience working with emerging markets specifically, and he can tell us what the key steps are at the beginning, what the special approach needs to be in this kind of situation. Mariano, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Constanza. First of all, I would like to greet all the distinguished participants in the panel today, and obviously thank the Center for the Study of Democracy for the invitation to participate in this dialogue. I would also like to congratulate the country to start this discussion about the future of offshore in Bulgaria, which is going to be key, as it was remarked before, for the decarbonization and energy security. From the World Bank, we are highly committed to offshore. We are currently supporting the development of offshore in new markets in over 20 countries. And maybe what is more relevant for the discussion is our recent engagement in Romania with resources from the EU Commission, from DG Reform, to support the process of the offshore wind. Romania has already committed in the RRP to create this framework for offshore, and we are in the path to support them in the framing of the roadmap for the country. So I believe that my colleagues have already preempted some of the topics that I wanted to emphasize, but nevertheless, I just want to highlight that the technology is delivering. If we compare with the cost of this technology in 2012, when the first wind farms were installed in some countries in Europe, the cost has dropped by 70%. We are now talking about prices which are nearly grid parity, with the latest auction cost falling to about 50 euros per megawatt hour in established markets. And now the technology allows to floating offshore in deeper water. It provides high capacity factors, as Benoit was mentioning, less variable output, reduces the land constraints. So basically, this technology is a future technology, needs to be part of the solution and contribute to the stability of the network and the decarbonization. It also brings along a lot of economic development for the country. But I would like to basically highlight some topics which we believe are key for the development of this technology in an emerging market. First of all, I would like to highlight that for this technology, scale is critical. There's a need for significant investment support. This was mentioned by my co-panelists, to invest in grids, in ports, vessels, logistics, supply chain. And this requires to develop a long-term planning. This is not something that can be just developed for one or two projects. Also, it's important, talking about the scale, the coordination that also was referred to by Victoria. I think the different countries developing now this technology in the Black Sea I think it could be important to have a coordinated approach. What is also key is large long-term government support and commitment. It's not only about the legal framework, it's about a long-term view of the government to basically be able to communicate to the industry that the plans are long-term, that there will be business in the coming years, so that the investment will be attracted to the country. It's important also to make a good analysis of the internal capacities, both at the industrial level, but also at the institutional and the government, because when we are discussing the different options in terms of legal and regulatory framework, in some cases we have seen that using one of the different options that may be available and tested by other countries, if you don't have the same capacities, maybe that would lead to a block in the development. So then this analysis should be leading also the decisions on the strategy and the roadmap and how to develop the sector in the country. A clear legislative framework, this is key. We need to provide clarity, transparency to the investors on the rules of the game. And then even if there are different options, and as I mentioned, there may be different levels of public participation depending on the option that the country would like to follow. It's important that whatever option is taken, the implementation is sound and aligned with the local capacities. If not, maybe the option may be perfect, but if it's not well implemented, I think it's a recipe for catastrophe. The final point I would like to mention, as we are also a bank, and I think it was also somehow introduced by Victoria, the bankability of the projects, the availability of financing. These investments are capital intensive, meaning that once the developers make the investment, they have little room to basically maneuver. They have fixed cost, which maybe it's over 90% of the total cost of the project. And they are subject to the variability of the prices in the markets. So basically, they need to cover this risk with CFC, as was mentioned before, or any other option. But it's very important because if not, the banks will not only provide more expensive financing, but also there may be even problems to get the financing. So this is also important when the country think about the design, to make sure that whatever design is provided is giving enough visibility on the future cash flows so that the banks can finance these projects. And just a final point, the World Bank is supporting different countries, as I mentioned before. We help in developing these roadmaps, which basically it's supporting the long-term strategy, where the legal framework is a key piece of this roadmap, but also the development of all these investments around this sector are very important. And we have developed some public knowledge work that maybe it's you can check. We have developed a document on key factors for successful development of offshore wind in emerging markets. We have another one on the environmental and social framework for offshore wind spatial planning. We develop an annual study tour with some countries to really learn about what is needed for establishing and growing a successful offshore wind market. So basically, and we also have support for country-specific analysis like policy, legal, approaches on tendering, geospatial mapping, grid integration. So basically, we are very much committed to the development of this technology, and we are very happy to support in any way that may be required. Thank you very much. I stop here because of I have many interesting panel after me and also the discussion. So thank you very much, and I will keep here to answer any question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariano, also for the exciting and interesting insights, but also for being very efficient and sticking to your 10 minutes. Indeed, as you said, offshore wind energy is becoming increasingly attractive and is very fast penetrating new markets, such as our neighbors, Romania and Greece. And to zoom in on one of these markets that has been a newcomer to offshore wind energy, I would like to invite Vasilis Triantafylos to take the floor. He's special advisor to the Secretary General for Energy and Mineral Resources at the Hellenic Ministry of Environment and Energy. And he has very interesting inside knowledge about how the legislative framework in Greece was developed and what the next steps are. So we are very excited to hear what he has to tell us. Vasilis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Constanza. Thank you very much for this invitation and this chance to address this audience and say a few words about how we basically approach the issue of offshore wind in Greece. At the beginning, I would like to say that many of the things I wanted to mention were already covered, so I'll be very, very brief. I will start by saying a year and a half ago, the Minister and the Secretary General, with the support of the Prime Minister, decided that we really wanted to do something on offshore wind in Greece. That was before all the energy crisis and all that. And the reasons why they chose to spearhead this effort and to really kickstart the sector were pretty much what was covered by panelists before at this session. So one of the things was the contribution of offshore wind to security of supply, or the increased capacity factors that Benoit mentioned before and all that, but also the matter of the prices. We see that in mature markets, His Excellency actually made that point. In mature markets, the prices of offshore wind are very close to grid parity, and no subsidies are needed. So we wanted to get there, and we decided that in Greece we will heavily invest in this sector. There is a third reason, which is specific to the country, but could also apply to other countries such as Bulgaria, which is that we have a lot of social reactions when it comes to installing onshore wind, particularly on the islands. And we have found, through discussions, that offshore wind is much more, if you treat it right, if you approach it correctly, it's much more suitable for island communities to accept than it is to have onshore wind on islands. So this also helped make us, make this approach a priority in the energy planning of the country. So this is the why. The how we did it is basically we adopted a three-pillar approach. The first pillar was to draft a comprehensive law describing all the processes that need to take place to be there in order to go from a strategic approach to have a target to actually having projects connected to the grid. This law was finalized and passed through Parliament a month ago. So you can see it wasn't an easy process. It took the best part of a year to actually finalize it and get it approved. There was a lot of discussions and a lot of opinions exchanged with industry stakeholders, with environmental organizations. Wind Europe has been very, very helpful in putting us in contact with industry actors across Europe to hear, to discuss with them and hear their opinions and what their priorities were, and to, let's say, concentrate all this information and integrate it in a way that works both for the investors, because they will actually have to put in the money and the effort to develop plants, and also for the country, of course, and the sensitivities and the interests that we want to see served. So we finished the law, and the law itself, the first pillar. And the law itself is, I would say it's close to what the CSD, the Center for the Study of Democracy, is proposing for Bulgaria. Of course, there are particularities that are different, but seeing also the policy recommendations and the study, the exceptional study that you have prepared, we also did a similar study in Greece, checking what the international experience is, and then trying to translate the lessons learned in the best way for Greece. So seeing the study and seeing the policy recommendations, I can identify that we've had we definitely flag the same issues, and in most situations we also we also selected the same approach in Bulgaria and Greece. The system is basically a centralized system as far as the site identification and selection is concerned. But once we select the sites, we then pass them on to investors, and they continue with what they do best, which is to develop the site with the best speed and the minimum cost. So we also have a system of auctions, and CFDs are the selected tool that will, let's say, secure the contractual arrangement between the state, the off-taker, and the developer. But of course, there's also the option for off-takers at some later point to take their projects to the market. And this is basically the key points of the law. And licensing will be done approximately the same way as the onshore wind, but with a very important notice of adapting the periods that the developer has, because those are different. This is also proposed in the CSD recommendations. I can get into detail into any part of the Greek law if you want later, and I will also provide CSD with a translated version of the law, which you can disseminate to participants in this workshop, and they can, of course, see it, and if they want, they can address us directly. So this is the first pillar, but I also want to say a few things about the other two important pillars in our strategy to develop offshore wind. After the law is in place, what we're doing is we're preparing a national program for the development of offshore wind. So basically, what is recommendation 5, the equivalent of the recommendation 5 of the CSD report. This is actually into law, and it's actually been written as we speak. This is a plan to develop offshore wind in the Greek seas by taking account all relevant factors. So we don't just examine what the wind speed is and what the depth is. We have made a list of 52, if I remember correctly, criteria that apply, and go from as I said, wind speed, depth, and various environmental criteria such as sea bottom, Posidonia, I don't know how you say it in English, and Natura zone, Natura 2000 zones, and all that, but also take into account tourism, touristic activities, other economic fishing, telecommunications lines, both those installed and those projected to be installed, defense, and we have actually been into contact with every stakeholder and public sector stakeholder, and we were informed about their concerns, and we tried to incorporate it into a holistic strategy that, I mean, you can't have everyone happy, but at least you can avoid all the obvious, all the big issues if you take this approach. And this, I think, will be fundamental in increasing the success, because when you have all the problems on the table at the beginning, then you can do a really good screening, and you can take out all the obvious issues. And of course, issues will always arise in a 10-year development process, but you minimize the risk, both the state risk and also the investor risk. When prospective investors understand, and we talk about them, and they understand what we're doing to prepare and to de-risk the sites, then they're really eager to see what those sites are and to participate in the auctions that we'll have in the second phase. And the third thing that is very important for us, and we will kickstart it this autumn, is stakeholder management, and basically awareness of what offshore wind does, what it can do, both for the country and its energy system, but also for local communities. So it's information, explaining to people what offshore wind stands for, but also there's incentives for local communities who will be called to host those huge and breathtaking, actually, installations. I've actually had the chance at the invitation of Wind Europe to visit one of the biggest in Europe, 2 years back, and I was awestruck. I mean, if people can really understand what this means for their region, I'm sure social reactions would be will go down to zero. So these are the three main approaches we had. I'm out of time. Just 2 quick notes on targets. Those are crucial. In Greece, our Prime Minister has set a political target of 2 gigawatts plus 500 megawatts of expedited pilot projects, so 2.5 gigawatts in 2030, and this will also be reflected in our revised NECP. We have already started the process. It will be over early 2023 to be submitted, and this will be the targets at minimum that will be included in the NECP, but also intermediate targets for 35, for 40, 45, and 50. This will be covered in the NECP. And on the CFDs, those are wonderful tools, wonderful tools. Just a quick example, we have CFDs for onshore wind in Greece since 2018. Let's say the average price is like 70 or 80 euros. Right now, the price in Greece might go up to 700 or 800 in the day, S&P. This is the marginal price. So what we do is the renewable producers with CFDs pay back 500 or 600 euro per megawatt hour produced, just get their CFD. And we use that money we get back from renewable producers to subsidize the retail bills for consumers. So basically, renewable energy is helping consumers pay a smaller electricity price. CFDs are fantastic. I will stop at that. Thank you again for the invitations and congratulations on the fantastic work.
Thank you so much, Vasilis, for sharing your hands-on experience and your views on CFDs as well. It's very encouraging to see that we have flagged similar issues and are planning to adopt a very similar approach to Greece. It seems that we are on the right track. Now I'm opening up the floor for questions and comments from the audience. And first, we would be really happy to hear what some of the representatives of the key political parties here present today have to say in terms of comments or even questions regarding our panel. And first of all, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Atanas Pekanov, who is Deputy Prime Minister for EU Funds. Mr. Pekanov, the floor is yours.
Dear all, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here, and thank you for this important work. As you know, Europe is in a difficult moment, but we should not lose our focus on the long-term targets of climate neutrality, of energy sustainability. Last year, while the caretaker government was working on programming the National Recovery and Resilience Plan, we put a lot of effort and a lot of focus on ensuring that achieving a low-carbon economy in Bulgaria would become a fact in the coming years. This work was also then continued by the regular government in the National Recovery and Resilience Plan. I'm sure we have put important reforms and important investments that will let us do that. As I said, Europe is now in a difficult moment, and there are some that question the feasibility of achieving all of this. Maybe in the short run, yes, the ambitions are becoming harder to achieve due to many difficulties, bottlenecks, rising inflation, economic uncertainty, which makes economic agents unsure whether they want to invest rapidly. But I want to say that I think clearly that in the longer run, achieving a low-carbon economy, achieving the goals of the Green Deal should continue to be a major priority. They become even more relevant today, since in the longer run, they will make us more autonomous, they will make our countries more sustainable and more energy independent from any geopolitical conflict. In the work last year, we have put important steps that will help us achieve this in the coming years. On one hand, reforms for the renewable energy sector. On the other hand, more investment in the renewable energy sector. exploration of geothermal energy. We have also to develop a hydrogen roadmap for the coming years. We also have put more resources. The plan includes more resources to expand the TSO, the system operator, which is a crucial part of ensuring that we can put more renewable energy in the system. However, with such huge challenges, there is always more to be done. And this is why I express my full support for the proposed regulatory framework for this very important work by the Center of the Study of the Democracy, which will enable us to explore a further source of renewable energy, a source that maybe we have not explored so far. And I see that in the world in the last decade, there has been huge growth in offshore wind energy. However, it continues to be a relatively small part of the mix, so there is a lot of potential there. One crucial part is, as was said, international cooperation between countries, but the second part is the regulatory framework. And let me say something from my own experience. Every time that I take a flight from Sofia to Vienna, where I reside in more normal times, when I'm next to the airport, when we are landing, I always see so much wind turbines nearby the Vienna airport. I have thought, how was this progress achieved? How have some countries achieved already what is necessary? Well, it all starts here. This is my personal opinion. It starts with the experts. It starts by finding the right solutions. Experts, the academic community, the non-governmental sector. The academic community, as I said, is crucial in finding the right solutions. And then when the right solutions, the right packages, reforms are identified, it is the task, it is the task of the politicians to then use them, implement them. And this is what we have to do in Bulgaria to catch up on so many different issues. This will also happen as part of the National Recovery and Resilience Plan. I'm really hopeful that even though there is so much political tension on such issues where we have common ground, where we have consensus, progress can be achieved and will be achieved. We need to do that for our country to explore its full potential in so many areas. And I'm thankful for the work that is being done here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pekanov. I think we have here also Mr. Radosław Rybarski, who was heading the National Energy Commission. And if he has some insights to share with us, I would like to give him the floor.
Thank you. Thank you also for inviting me here. As chairman of the Energy Committee to the National Assembly, we already did the first step, which I believe was a critical one. Once I realized that the Center for Study of Democracy has a special study for offshore wind, we get together all stakeholders and we summoned the committee. And then we realized that all political parties, despite their differences now and then, they all consent to such an initiative on the legal framework for offshore wind. And I believe once we have a draft law, the process could start right away with discussions in the National Assembly. And we were ready actually to do that in July. Unfortunately, we have to go through another elections, and hopefully in October, November, we'll be able to restart the process. But offshore wind is a topic that all parties support. Our party is also in full support of this new energy and new industry that will emerge in Bulgaria. I also believe that for the time being, while all the legal framework is being designed and discussed, we should not waste the time, but also emphasize on further studies of the potential for offshore wind in Bulgaria. Also, wind assessments, they doesn't need any special legal framework. Wind assessments, the more you have it, the better. This is my experience from wind parks onshore. So this will help to accelerate the process once we have the legal framework afterwards. And also mapping of areas that have offshore wind potential. Legal framework is on one side, but this preparation will help investors to jump in right away once we have this special law, or either we could also figure out if it could be done through the existing Renewable Energy Act, because the Renewable Energy Act is also about to be amended, and it needs some amendments. In the Parliament was also discussed and submitted as an amendment to the existing law, contract for difference for some of the existing renewable energy projects. Unfortunately, this was also not, didn't have the time to go through the process. So I believe that the process will be able to continue right away in November, and my political party is in full support of offshore wind in Bulgaria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rybarski. It's really great to see how much support we already have and political will to develop the wind industry, the offshore wind industry in Bulgaria. Now we have time for at least a couple of questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and please introduce yourself before asking your question. Thank you.
Yep, terrific. Thank you very much, and thank you for the wonderful presentations. Martin Sokolov from the Secretariat of the National Security Council. And first of all, I have to point out almost no expertise in energy security, and this is how you can guess that you've done a terrific job, because even without expertise, I very much appreciated your remarks. I have two questions. The first one is a bit, it's not addressed to anyone specifically, but taking into account we are right now talking about developing and employing the energy framework, is there a realistic and optimistic scenario in terms of a time frame, how long it would take from the first time it is adopted to actually start having quantifiable, measurable energy production as an alternative to certain imports? And second of all, I think I would like to address this to Dr. Trifonova, because in your recommendations, you point out that it's a good idea to develop an interdisciplinary committee under the jurisdiction of the Council of Ministers. I'm sure that there's a lot of thought into this, but what is the biggest pro in your opinion that it should be under the jurisdiction of the Council of Ministers and not under another ministry, for example? Thank you very much.
Yeah, if Maria would like to answer that question.
Yeah, I will answer the second question, and then I think probably Victoria can share the best experience on the first one. In terms of the interdisciplinary authority that we are proposing, the problem is that such kind of one-stop shop, as mentioned or called in our report, needs interdisciplinary expertise from which is currently distributed towards 4 ministries in Bulgaria. We propose such kind of council to consist of representatives of these ministries, including also representatives of non-governmental sector. Here, particularly, we suggest the environmental organizations. And we think that the most important reason to place this authority under the jurisdiction of a ministerial council is just to avoid the conflicting responsibility between ministries, and to put it on a higher level, because in Bulgaria, it's a small country, and we really know that most policy-making processes and permitting processes, they happen in a very centralized way. So just to avoid different conflicts and to have a common ground for all these authorities, we actually proposed the council to be placed under the jurisdiction of the Ministerial Council.
And then on your first question then, I unfortunately do not own a crystal ball to be able exactly to tell you what would be feasible. But let me say this. The good thing in this situation for Bulgaria is that there is already a lot of experience that we have in offshore wind development. So there certainly are lessons learned that we can take from other countries. The bad thing is that we're starting from scratch, okay? So obviously it will take some time. Normally, what has been the biggest obstacle to quick realization of wind energy projects, both onshore and offshore wind so far, has been the permitting processes. And this is something where we now see very important steps coming out of the European Union that the member states are also translating. There is a huge push to streamline the permitting processes for different installations. And even because I'm trying to also give you concrete examples, we were saying here, for instance, the UK has a very vibrant offshore market. With their latest auction rounds, they even decided to cut down the permitting processes from 4 years for offshore wind to 1 year. And this is also a very clear signal that we want to push towards this transition going forward. And then the second thing, which is probably also important, is of course the state of the supply chain that is able to deliver these volumes. I think the wind industry supply chain has a lot of potential, but again, for as long as the permitting takes a very long time, for as long as you're not clear on the targets, on the long-term visibility, it would be extremely difficult to track the necessary investment in the short time phrase where you want the project to be starting. This would be my quick remarks on this question.
Do we have any additional questions from the audience? Yes.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Kalina Todorova. I'm from the National Electric Company. Unfortunately, my question goes to one of the online presenters. I'm not sure if they're still available. In relation to the presentation for the Danish experience, and Mr. Benoit Bizet, sorry if I mispronounce your name, it was mentioned that they are thinking about moving away from the model of lowest price per megawatt hour into a different model. So obviously my question would be, what kind of alternatives are being considered? And most importantly, why? Thank you so much for all presenters.
Thank you for your question. Yes, can you hear me again?
Yes, loud and clear.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your question. There are a lot of consideration in why changing awarding model. For many years, Denmark has chosen a CFD model, like a single-sided CFD, where it was meant to award for the equivalent of the production of 50,000 full load hours. That means that it was securing a return of investment for the developers on about 11 to 12 years, depending on the site and the technology that was chosen. This was the model that was preferred for some years, but it was also taking into consideration that the TSO was developing the transmission assets. The last tender for Thor was a switch in many ways in how Denmark has seen the development of offshore wind. They decided to also put the transmission assets within the tender material. So the developer will have to tender both to propose a price for both the offshore wind farm and the transmission assets until the point of connection onshore. This switch has also been accompanied by a double-sided CFD, as was also mentioned today, where the price, the electricity price, will decide whether the developer will pay or receive money, and that will be so on the entire lifetime of the wind farm, not only on this short term. The next thing that will be happening is that we've seen that the Thor has actually proposed 5 out of 6 zero bid, which has been leading the Danish government to draw the winner of the tender, which is absolutely not an optimal situation. So in order to avoid having a draw, there must be some other criteria to award the wind farm, but the price only. So that would be the things that Denmark will be considered, also in collaboration with EU. I know that EU is also recommending that there will be a split on the awarding criteria. That could be 70% on the price and 20% on the socio-economical aspects, and 10% on project viability or local deployment or any other things. All these things must be considered, and I also think that it's something that you should also consider, because I guess that the wind energy, and especially offshore wind energy, has shown that it's a competitive production of electricity, and it's actually the lowest considering the capacity factors. And I think that there is a very strong factor to also put into that. It must be developed sustainably. That means that it's also where you should also consider how to secure sustainable development of your supply chain in Bulgaria. I hope it answered your question, and otherwise just let me know. I'd be happy to add some comments on that.
Yes, thank you very much. Especially the European perspective was really helpful.
Thank you so much, Benoit. And also I would like to thank all of our speakers for their very interesting presentations and statements, and also the audience for being here and offering some very interesting questions as well. With this, I would like to say once again, thank you all for being here. And I would like to give the word to Martin Vladimirov to offer some closing remarks for this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Constanza, and thank you to a great panel and a great discussion after that. It's very clear that we have gathered the people that are most relevant to the topic in Bulgaria, and I think in the region. And offshore wind energy has a bright future in the Black Sea. It would unlock not only renewable energy transition, but it would unlock economic growth for coastal communities, especially in areas which have been underdeveloped. And it's great to hear that there is commitment on the side of the interim government that plays increasingly important role for the low carbon transition due to the political instability in the country. And from one of the key energy policy makers in the country over the last year as well, Mr. Embark, who has been spearheading this effort of developing a new legislative framework. We'll be happy to work on this in the fall. We're looking forward to the new parliament and amending this proposal and finding a way to pass it as soon as possible, because we don't want to miss the wave of the offshore wind energy development in Europe. We are behind, but I think we are able to catch up really quickly with so many experts around the world. Thank you so much, and looking forward to a bright future for offshore wind. Thank you. Have a great day.